I began the sermon this morning with a story from my own life, from when I was teaching elementary school in Kentucky many years ago. I was unpacking children's books at the time, and my principal, Jay Jordan, walked into my classroom and he closed the door. He surveyed my room and he shook his head. Definitely a Keith Kron fourth grade classroom. A few books here, a few chairs there, 2 bulletin boards scattered all over the floor. My desk was already swamped with papers, and the school year wouldn't start for 2 days yet. We looked at each other, and I knew. I was at the OK Corral. I wasn't sure what I was about to be shot for, but I knew something was up. Perhaps you've seen the face and the fidgeting of a 9-year-old child who lied to you 20 minutes before about having to use the restroom and now really needs to go. Well, my principal looked somewhat less composed than that. He asked me if I'd gotten his message from the day before about wanting to talk to him about something. I told him I had. Silence. More fidgeting. I began to have an inkling of what this conversation was going to be about. I'm glad we did this on your turf, Jay said. I'm glad we're doing this on your turf, he said. And he looked at me for a minute and I nodded. Silence. And Jay took a breath. You know that Tristan Burke is no longer on your class list. I nodded again. His mother made me take him out of your class. Jay looked down and then back up. I nodded again. Tristan's mother was president of the PTA that year. I only vaguely knew who Tristan was, and the only thing I knew about him was that he was the most effeminate boy I'd encountered in 5 years of teaching. His mother made me take him out of your class because she says she knows you're a homosexual. I don't know how she knows it, but she knows it. Jay looked at me, and I looked at him. And I could see the wheels spinning in his head. I would wonder later if he could see the wheels spinning in mine. Fortunately and sadly, I'd prepared for that moment. I had no doubts it would come at some point. Years of thinking about it had almost kept me from going into teaching, yet the desire to teach had won out. I knew to say nothing. I knew to wait to be asked, and then I would answer yes. Only then. I raised my eyebrows back at him. More silence. Part of me was hoping that he would ask, that I would be given an opportunity to tell him, that I could finally tell my story. He didn't ask. He broke the silence. This is ridiculous, he said. You're not the type of person to harm children. We looked at each other, and I nodded quietly, realizing the support that I was getting from him. It was a bittersweet moment for both of us. Jay finally mumbled, I shouldn't have pulled him out of your class. She would have made your year horrible, I said. Mine too, for that matter. It's okay. Jay nodded quietly back at me. We did reading groups today, and I said, Tristan will be in my class for reading. It's an hour each day. Jay was firmer now. You'll get my backing. She'll just have to deal with it. There's another parent concerned too. I'll deal with him as well. We won't talk about this ever again. Jay surveyed my room. Now get this room cleaned up. I don't know how you're going to be ready to start teaching in 2 days. He spun on his heels and he turned toward the door. He opened it and he turned back to me. I'm glad we did this on your turf, he repeated. And he looked at me one last time, tried to smile, and he left, closing the door behind him. For the next 4 years, I never heard any of those complaints again. Tristan and I got along famously. I invited his mother to come into reading class and to help when she could, and she did. And she and I laughed a lot together that year. From me, she learned all about the fine art of teasing children, and probably a few other things. It occurs to me I should tell you why I'm here, why I'm now a Unitarian Universalist minister, director of our transitions office, here leading the Beyond Categorical Thinking workshop this weekend, and am not teaching 4th grade anymore. I left teaching elementary school because I was afraid. Now, it's more than being afraid of being found out and fired for being a known homosexual. That was certainly a part of it. The longer I stuck around in Kentucky, the greater the odds were that my private life would become public knowledge. My parents, who've not used the words gay or homosexual in the 30 years I've been out to them, are a part of the story, too. My father was an elementary school principal in the same school system I taught in. My mother taught 1st grade at a neighboring school as well. I never had the opportunity of thinking of fighting this battle alone. And my folks had given me a lifetime of modeling to know how to overprotect people. I knew any public battle I chose to engage in there would also have included them. I lived 4 lives when I lived in Lexington, Kentucky. I lived a work life where I loved the work of teaching elementary school. I lived a family life where I had dinner with my folks once a week, visited my grandmother a lot, overspent on my relatives at Christmas. I lived a gay life where I hung out with my friends, led a support group, and played volleyball. I lived a religious life where I sat on nearly every committee of my home Unitarian Universalist congregation and would move on to district and denominational work beyond that. I certainly began to see some overlapping. Certainly my work life and my family life overlapped some. And as I came out in my congregation, my gay life and my religious life began to merge. I worked very hard at making my congregation a place that would be welcoming for bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender people. I worked very hard at bringing bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender people into our congregation, and it happened. It happened in part because I and others started telling our stories in church. I was able to tell the story of having a crush on Mr. Gardner, my high school drama teacher, and as a 17-year-old working up the courage to tell him about that crush. I was able to tell the story of going to a very Southern Baptist church and having my Anita Bryant-type Sunday school teacher ask me if I agreed with her that homosexuals were sick people. I was able to tell the story of coming out to my parents and having my own father ask me if I was going to molest children, while my mother cried. I was able to tell the story of meeting a Unitarian Universalist minister one night in a gay bar, and that's how I first learned about Unitarian Universalism. I was becoming aware not only could I be 11 and 10 and 9 and 8 and 7 and 6 and 5 and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1, but I could talk about them as well. You see, my real fear was not that someone like my principal would ask me if I was gay, would ask me my story. My real fear is that I would never get to tell it. This is what the radical right wants, to control our society so that only certain approved stories can be told. This is why the work we did yesterday in the Beyond Categorical Thinking workshop about seeing people, seeing ministers as more than a single story is so vitally important. I was afraid I would never get to have a life. I was afraid I would always have 4 of them. My fear is not that my private life would become public knowledge. My fear is either that it never would or would happen only on someone else's terms. When I hear people say they want to make sure they have a private life and a public life, I wonder, do they really want 2 lives? Categories for human beings really are a bad idea, and I think I learned that during my conversation with my principal. As an aside, I do understand that people are talking about control and choice when they make the point about wanting to have a private life. I'm all for that. I just believe as human beings we do better when we only have one life to juggle. It's more than enough to do. So it was after this conversation with my principal that I began to know that I needed to make a change. I looked around me and I became sadly aware of the number of people I knew who were also leading more than one life at a time. There was my good friend and teaching colleague across the hallway who had at one time been married to a man who had a sexual addiction for children, and she felt like she could never talk about this with anyone. My own father, who tries to pretend that he never had a father and never talks about him. My friend Steve, who quit playing the piano because he became a librarian. I still haven't quite figured that one out. My friend Sandra, who told no one about her live-in boyfriend Dick. All of these people and so many more who never got to be 11. It was hardest for me to see in the children I taught. Children who came to school and then had to go home and cook and clean for younger brothers and sisters. Children who knew they could not fail. Children who would go home to wars. Children whom would have to parent their parents. And by the time they were 9 years old, they already knew they had to keep these lives quiet. Religious educator Maria Harris talks about implicit education, what we teach without ever actually saying it out loud. I knew I was implicitly teaching my students to have more than one life. There had to be a better way. And I looked at how I might make it a better way, and I learned of cities that had non-discrimination policies for teachers, but back then at that time, I didn't trust that those were real. I looked at the amount of work I had to do, and I thought about the fact that I often spent more time documenting what I taught, how I taught it, and who was there to hear it, than I did get to teach some days. So I decided to look elsewhere. The person I saw doing the most teaching was my minister, and the other Unitarian Universalist ministers I knew. And they didn't have to fill out report cards either. I remember Jesus was a teacher in many ways. Rabbis consider themselves to be teachers. And I watched the Unitarian Universalist ministers I knew, and I watched the way they taught people around them, often by telling stories. Often their own stories. At the same time, I'd begun leading homophobia workshops in Unitarian Universalist congregations. Now, not how to have more of it, but how to have less. And I learned quickly 3 things about teaching adults. 1, they don't necessarily have a longer attention span than children. They just do a better job of faking. Usually engaging people on an emotional level increases their attentiveness. 2, adult learning is as much about unlearning as it is about learning. 3, the product isn't nearly as important as the process. So how would you teach someone to be less homophobic, less transphobic, less biphobic, less sexist, racist, ableist? Well, explicitly, you're teaching them about that oppression. Implicitly, you're teaching them about vulnerability. Now that's where the possum shows up. That's where the magic happens. Because as people let themselves become more vulnerable, they become stronger, and they become less racist, less sexist, less ableist, less homophobic, less biphobic, less transphobic. And I did this through telling stories. Sometimes my own stories. And I was blessed with the stories of others. And I saw the possibility for having one life. A friend of mine from seminary and I were talking one day, and she said you could learn a fair amount about a person by asking them these 4 questions. 1, when did you stop singing? 2, when did you stop dancing? 3, when did you stop playing? 4. When did you stop telling your story? For the record, I stopped singing in 3rd grade when Mrs. Rice said I shouldn't sing anymore. Though I'll still hum to myself if I think people aren't looking. I still go dancing, I still play. And as I told my friend Marianne, it's more a matter of when I started telling my story than when I stopped. I stopped telling my story at 14. It'd be 10 years before I started telling some of my stories again. And it's only since I've become a Unitarian Universalist minister that I've not had to figure out what story I could tell where. Like the story of the possum, one story leads to another story. And when we hear our story in someone else's story, well, that's the magic. That's when we encounter mystery. What are your stories? Have you stopped telling them? Do you only tell them in certain places, in certain lives? How well do you know the stories of those around you? The stories in this room, your stories, are magical. And I hope you are not afraid to tell them. They are your life, and they let you be fully 11, or whatever age you are. A final story, also from the Van Gogh Cafe. This is the story of the Silent Star, and then I will close. It is winter at the cafe. Mark is in the back cooking, though the restaurant is empty. Clara's putting napkins into the napkin holders when a man walks in. He is tall, slender, and moves like water. He is strikingly handsome and a fabulous dresser. Black cloak, black cashmere scarf, black wool gloves, black cane. His white hair sets it off perfectly. He must be 90. Clara takes his order. Tea plain. Boiled egg, please. Thank you. Clara thinks there is something romantic about him. After his food is served, Mark comes out of the kitchen looking for his watch. He looks around and he sees the man. Mark stops what he is doing and he stares. He stares because he knows who the elegant man in the cafe is. He is a star. Clara doesn't know, of course. She's watched the old films with her father, but except for Chaplin, she doesn't know their names, only their movements. And perhaps it is the way that the elegant man has moved through the cafe that it reminds her of something that she has seen before. Reminds everyone, but none can quite place the memory. The breakfast hours pass, and people come and go their way to work, to the mall at the edge of town, back home. But the elegant man stays on, and he's hardly touched his egg. His teacup is still half full. And the door of the Van Gogh Cafe opens and closes. Opens and closes. Yet he stays on looking out the window. Finally, Mark cannot help himself. When there is no one left in the cafe, Mark walks over to his table. Clara, who is curious, shyly follows. Mark offers his hand, and the man gracefully takes it, and they shake. I know your work, Mark says softly. I love it. I love all of your films. Clara's eyes are wide. She has not known until now that a star is in her cafe, and the old man blushes and smiles. Thank you, he says. There is an awkward moment. Then graciously he offers Mark and Clara the 2 empty chairs at his table. Happily they sit. Mark and the Silent Star talk about the old films as Clara listens. There is an innocence in her father's face that she has not seen before. He is like a boy. And the Silent Star seems pleased, quietly thrilled, to talk of his work with someone who knows it so well. To finally tell his story. He laughs and sighs and even trembles slightly, reliving it all. There is a moment when each is quiet, catching a breath. Why, sir, are you at the Van Gogh Cafe? Mark gently asks. And the old man seems glad someone has asked, and he reaches into his coat and he pulls forth an old photograph. He hands it first to Clara and then to Mark. Mark looks carefully at the building in the picture. Is this? Yes, says the silent star. The building is the Van Gogh Cafe in 1923 when it was still a theater. He and I did some shows here together. This summer we met. And the silent star smiles and puts the photograph back into his coat. Today I am waiting for him. Clara's heart is pounding. She feels like she herself is in a movie. Each gesture the man makes, each word the man speaks, it's so beautiful to her. She knows the cafe remembers this man. She can feel it drawing into him, reaching for this man who's been a part of the first magic on the stage of the old theater. Oddly, not one person has walked into the cafe to break this spell. Mark offers the star a fresh cup of tea and a piece of apple pie, which are gratefully accepted. Then Mark and Clara leave the old man to his waiting. The lunch hours come and go, and then the dinner hours. The silent star waits. Occasionally, Clara or Mark offer him something, but he politely declines. And they find themselves watching the door, watching the window, waiting for a beautiful young man in a top hat and waistcoat. Finally, it's time to close, and still the old man is waiting. He seems very tired now, tired but unworried. He asks Mark if he might sit by the window a little longer. Of course, says Mark, though he offers his guest room to the man, offers to take him home for the evening and to return him to the table by the window the next day. But the man is certain that his friend is coming very soon. Very soon, he says. So Mark takes Clara home a few hours later to check on the old man. At first he thinks the man is asleep. And then he realizes that the man has died. And in the old man's hand, Mark finds a newspaper clipping that is cracked and yellow. The clipping shows the face of the beautiful young man in the top hat and waistcoat. It reports that he was drowned in 1936. And in the old man's other hand is the same photograph that Mark and Clara were shown, but now the photograph has changed. The beautiful young man is gone, and there's only a soft, empty light where he was standing. Mark and Clara keep the photograph and the newspaper clipping inside a small box near the cash register. And every so often, when things are quiet, they pull these out and they look at them again. They each think how perfect it is that the silent star has died, where he found his true love, and that he came back to the Van Gogh Cafe, and he waited for his friend to take him home. Whatever forces are against you, whatever pain and suffering is yours, whatever joy you have, whatever your story is, my wish for you is that you share your story whenever and wherever you choose. Whether you are 11 or 90 or somewhere in between. Sing, dance, play, tell your stories. Listen to the stories of others. Live your one life and feel. Feel its magic.